The ink on the marriage contract hadn't even dried before 19-year-old Elora realized her life was over. She wasn't a bride. She was a receipt for her father's gambling debts. Standing in the rain outside the chapel, shivering in a dress that felt more like a shroud, she looked up at the man who now owned her. Silas Thorne, the Duke of Blackwood, was 20 years her senior, a man with a face made of stone and a reputation carved from ice. She thought he wanted an heir. She thought he wanted a trophy. She never suspected that the monster of Blackwood Manor was the only person who had ever truly seen her. The late afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows of the Vance estate, illuminating the floating motes of dust that danced in the stagnant air. It was a dying house, a place of faded velvet and chipped porcelain, a perfect metaphor for the family that inhabited it. Elora Vance sat in the corner of the library, her charcoal-stained fingers moving feverishly across a sketchpad. This was her sanctuary, the only place where the crumbling walls of her reality couldn't touch her. On the paper, a bird was taking flight, breaking free from a cage of thorny vines. It was a crude metaphor, perhaps, but at 19, Elora felt the weight of those vines more than most. Paris, she whispered to herself, the word tasting like sweet wine. Just 6 more months. She had a plan. A secret stash of coins hidden beneath the loose floorboard in her bedroom, money she had earned by selling sketches under a pseudonym to the local print shop. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for a ticket. Enough to get her to the art academies where women were beginning to find a voice. She didn't want marriage. She didn't want a title. She wanted to create. The heavy oak doors of the library slammed open, shattering her reverie. Lord Reginald Vance, the Baron of Oakhaven, stumbled in. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat glistening on his receding hairline. He smelled of brandy and desperation. "Elora," he barked, loosening his cravat as if it were strangling him. "Put that childish scribbling away. We have guests." Elora quickly closed her sketchbook, hugging it to her chest. "Guests, father? We haven't entertained in months. The cook hasn't even been paid." "Silence!" Reginald snapped, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route. "It is not a social call. It is a negotiation. And it is concluded." Elora stood up, a cold knot forming in her stomach. "Negotiation? Father, what have you done?" Reginald poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter, his hand trembling. "I have saved us, girl. I have pulled this family back from the brink of total ruin. The creditors were at the door, Elora. They were going to take everything. The house, the land, your mother's jewelry." "You lost the jewelry last winter," Elora reminded him, her voice trembling. "Details." He waved a dismissive hand. "The point is, the debt is cleared. Every penny. And in exchange, I have secured you a future most girls would kill for." Elora felt the blood drain from her face. She knew this tone. She knew the way her father looked when he had gambled something he couldn't afford to lose. "Who?" she whispered. "The Duke of Blackwood," Reginald muttered into his glass. The sketchbook slipped from Elora's fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Silas Thorne. The Duke of Blackwood. He was a legend in the county, but not the kind mothers told their daughters to aspire to. He was 42 years old, a recluse who lived in a fortress of grey stone on the edge of the jagged cliffs. Rumours clung to him like moss. They said his first wife had died of loneliness, or worse. They said he had a temper that could shatter glass, that he was scarred, cold, and incapable of human affection. "He is old enough to be my father," Elora choked out. "He is 42, not 80, Reginald countered. "And he is the wealthiest man in England. You will want for nothing. Dresses, jewels, servants. I don't want jewels, Elora cried, tears pricking her eyes. I want my life. I want to paint. I was going to Paris, Father. I was leaving. Reginald laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Paris? With what? The pennies you hide under your floorboard. Oh yes, I found them. I used them to buy a new coat for the wedding. Elora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The betrayal was a physical blow. You took my money? I took my money, he corrected, stepping closer, his face hardening. You are my daughter. You are my property until I hand you to another. And tomorrow, Elora, you belong to the Duke. I won't do it, she said, backing away until she hit the cold wall of the library. I will run away. And go where? Reginald sneered. You have nothing, and if you run, Silas Thorne will not just bankrupt me. He will have me thrown in debtor's prison. Is that what you want? To see your father rot in a cell because of your selfish little doodles? The guilt was a weapon he wielded with expert precision. Elora looked at her father, pathetic, selfish, and broken, and knew she was trapped. The cage she had drawn in her sketchbook wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was her life. When? She asked, her voice hollow. Tomorrow, Reginald said, downing his drink. He doesn't believe in long engagements. Pack your things, Elora, and burn those drawings. A duchess does not stain her fingers with charcoal. The wedding day dawned grey and weeping. A relentless drizzle coated the world in a sheen of misery, turning the dirt roads to sludge. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. Silas Thorne had requested a private ceremony at the small stone chapel on the edge of the Vance estate. Elora stood before the mirror in her mother's old wedding dress. It had been taken in hastily by the maid, but it still hung loose on her frame, the lace yellowed with age. She looked like a ghost. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, exposing the pale curve of her neck. Her green eyes, usually bright with curiosity, were dull and rimmed with red. You look acceptable, her father grunted from the doorway. He wouldn't look her in the eye. They rode to the chapel in silence. When the carriage stopped, Elora's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stepped out into the rain, the mud instantly staining the hem of her gown. And there he was. Standing at the altar, Silas Thorne dominated the small space. He was taller than she had imagined, broad-shouldered and imposing in a black coat that seemed to absorb the dim light. As Elora walked down the short aisle, her father's grip on her arm bruisingly tight, the Duke turned. He was not handsome in the traditional sense. His face was hard, composed of sharp angles and a strong jaw. A silver scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a war he never spoke of. His eyes were the color of steel, cold, impenetrable, and intense. He didn't smile. He didn't look at her father. He looked only at her. For a moment, Elora felt stripped bare. It was as if those steel eyes were dissecting her, searching for flaws, for weakness. She lifted her chin, refusing to cower. If I am to be sold, she thought, I will not look like a victim. Silas's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something. Surprise? Respect? Passing through them before vanishing behind the ice. The ceremony was a blur of Latin words and heavy silence. When the priest asked for the ring, Silas produced a band of heavy gold, inset with a single, dark sapphire. It was beautiful, but it felt heavy as a shackle when he slid it onto her trembling finger. His hand was large, rough-skinned, and incredibly warm. The heat of his touch shocked her, contrasting sharply with the coldness of his demeanor. I now pronounce you man and wife, the priest murmured, looking eager to be done with the somber affair. Silas did not kiss her. He merely nodded to the priest, then turned to Elora. "The carriage is waiting," he said. His voice was deep, a baritone that seemed to vibrate in her chest. It wasn't unkind, but it was devoid of any softness. "My things," Elora started. "Are already loaded," Silas said. He turned to Lord Vance, who was hovering nearby, looking like a man waiting for a pouch of gold. Silas reached into his coat and withdrew a thick envelope. He tossed it onto the pew, not even deigning to hand it to the Baron. "The debt is cleared. Never contact her again." Reginald scrambled for the envelope, tearing it open to check the contents. He didn't even look up as his daughter was led away. "Father," Elora whispered, a final plea for acknowledgement. Reginald was too busy counting banknotes. Elora felt a tear slip down her cheek, hot and stinging. Before she could wipe it away, a large hand blocked the view of her father. Silas stood between them, a solid wall of black wool. "He does not deserve your tears, Lady Blackwood," Silas said quietly. "Let us go." The journey to Blackwood Manor took 4 hours. For the entire duration, Silas sat opposite her in the velvet-lined carriage, reading documents. He did not speak. He did not offer her comfort. He simply existed, a looming, silent presence. Elora stared out the window as the landscape changed. The rolling green hills of her childhood gave way to craggy rocks and wind-swept moors. The trees became twisted and sparse. They were entering the Duke's territory, a land as harsh and unforgiving as the man himself. As twilight fell, the manor came into view. It was a Gothic monstrosity of dark stone, perched precariously on a cliff overlooking the churning grey sea. Towers spiraled into the mist, and gargoyles leered down from the eaves. It looked like a prison. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones of the courtyard. Servants were lined up, their heads bowed, looking terrified. Silas stepped out and offered his hand to help her down. Again, the shock of his warmth. "Mrs. Higgins," Silas addressed a stern-looking woman in a starch-stiff apron. "Show her grace to her quarters. Dinner will be served in 1 hour." "My quarters?" Elora asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Are we not sharing?" She blushed furiously as she said it, the reality of the wedding night looming over her like a storm cloud. Silas looked down at her. His expression was unreadable, but his jaw tightened. "I sleep in the East Wing. You have been given the master suite in the West Wing. You will have your privacy, Elora." He used her name. It sounded strange on his tongue, intimate yet distant. Without another word, he turned and strode into the shadows of his home, leaving his young bride standing in the cold wind, wondering why the reprieve of a separate bedroom felt so much like rejection. Mrs. Higgins curtsied, though her eyes were pitying. "This way, Your Grace. The Duke. He is a man of solitary habits. Best not to disturb him." Elora followed the housekeeper through winding corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The house was silent, save for the distant crashing of the waves. She was the Duchess of Blackwood now, the mistress of this great, terrifying estate. But as she entered her room, a cavernous space filled with heavy furniture and tapestries depicting hunting scenes, she curled up on the massive bed and finally let herself weep. She cried for the Paris rain she would never feel, for the sketches she had left behind, and for the long, lonely life that stretched out before her in this stone tomb. She didn't know that down the hall, in the shadows of the library, Silas Thorne was standing by the window, watching the reflection of her candlelight in the glass, his hand clenched so tight around a glass of whiskey that the crystal was beginning to crack. The first month at Blackwood Manor passed not in days, but in varying shades of grey. Elora felt less like a bride and more like a haunting. She drifted through the endless corridors, her footsteps swallowed by thick wool carpets, her reflection passing like a spectre in the gilded mirrors that lined the walls. She rarely saw Silas. He was a man consumed by the management of his vast estates. He left before she woke, the sound of his horse's hooves on the cobblestones serving as her morning alarm. He returned long after the sun had dipped below the violent sea, sequestering himself in his study. Dinner was a formal, excruciating affair. They sat at opposite ends of a mahogany table, long enough to seat 20. The silence between them was so heavy it felt like a third diner, uninvited and suffocating. "Is the venison to your liking?" he would ask, not looking up from his plate. "It is delicious, Your Grace," she would reply, her voice sounding small and tinny in the cavernous room. "Silas," he would correct, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "I have told you. Call me Silas." "Yes, Silas." And that would be the extent of their conversation. He never asked about her day, perhaps because he knew her days were empty. She had no friends here. The local gentry kept their distance, frightened of the ogre of Blackwood, and the servants, though polite, treated her like a porcelain doll that might shatter if spoken to directly. Deprived of her art, Elora felt herself fading. Her father's command to burn her sketches haunted her, and she hadn't dared to pick up a charcoal stick since arriving. She felt that if she drew, she would be admitting that she had hope, and hope was a dangerous thing in this stone prison. The isolation reached a breaking point on a Tuesday in late November. A carriage arrived, bearing the crest of the neighbouring estate. Elora, desperate for any distraction, rushed to the foyer, smoothing her skirts. A woman swept in, bringing with her a cloud of expensive perfume and an air of entitlement. She was beautiful in a sharp, predatory way. Blonde hair perfectly coiffed, eyes blue and biting. "You must be the child bride," the woman said, handing her fur wrap to Mrs. Higgins without looking at her. "I am Lady Rosalind, a friend of the Duke's." Elora curtsied clumsily. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor. The Duke is out inspecting the mines, I'm afraid." Rosalind laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I know where Silas is. I didn't come to see him. I came to see what he bought with all that money." She circled Elora, looking her up and down with undisguised disdain. "A little thin, a little pale. I suppose he wanted something moldable after the tragedy." "Tragedy?" Elora asked, her pulse quickening. Rosalind stopped, arching a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, you don't know. Typical Silas. Buries everything. His first wife, Eleanor. She didn't just die, darling. She went mad. Couldn't stand the silence. Couldn't stand him." She leaned in all close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say he drove her to it. His coldness is a disease, little girl. It catches, and you look like you've already been infected." Elora felt the blood drain from her face. "That is enough," she managed to say, though her voice shook. "Is it?" Rosalind smirked. "I was supposed to be the Duchess, you know. Before he decided he wanted a pretty little debt payment instead of a partner, I would have known how to handle him. You? You'll be jumping off the cliffs before Christmas." "Get out!" a voice boomed from the doorway. Elora jumped. Silas stood there, framed by the storm brewing outside. He was wet, his hair plastered to his forehead, mud splattered on his boots. He looked terrifying. Rosalind paled, taking a step back. "Silas, darling, I said, get out!" Silas roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Mrs. Higgins, escort Lady Rosalind to her carriage. If she ever sets foot on this property again, I will have the dogs released." Rosalind, looking genuinely frightened for the first time, gathered her skirts and fled, Mrs. Higgins hurrying after her. Silence descended on the foyer. Elora stood trembling, her hands clutching her dress. She waited for him to yell at her, to blame her for the intrusion. Silas turned to her. His chest was heaving. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. "Did she hurt you?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," Elora whispered. She said, "I know what she said." Silas cut her off. He walked past her toward the stairs, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt of heat through her. He paused on the bottom step, his back to her. "Do not listen to the ghosts of this house, Elora. They lie." He marched upstairs, leaving a trail of muddy boot prints. Elora watched him go, realizing that for the first time he had defended her. But the defense felt like a wall being built higher, not a door opening. 2 days after the incident with Lady Rosalind, Silas vanished. Mrs. Higgins informed Elora that the Duke had urgent business in London and would be gone for a week. He hadn't said goodbye. Elora told herself she didn't care, that the house was easier to breathe in without his brooding presence. But at night, the wind howled around the towers, and the empty master suite felt vast and terrifying. She realized with a shock that she missed the heavy, reassuring sound of his footsteps. She spent the week exploring the West Wing, trying to find the source of the madness Rosalind had spoken of. She found nothing but dust and locked doors. The house wasn't haunted by spirits. It was haunted by silence. On the 7th day, the carriage returned. Elora was in the garden, staring listlessly at a frozen fountain, when she heard the wheels on the gravel. She didn't run to greet him. She stayed where she was, wrapping her shawl tighter against the biting wind. Minutes later, she heard the crunch of boots on the frost-covered grass. "It is too cold to be out here without a coat," Silas's voice came from behind her. Elora turned. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes darker than before. But he wasn't wearing his usual severe black coat. He held a large wooden box under one arm, and in his other hand he carried a long, wrapped cylinder. "I am fine," she said, lifting her chin. "I am used to the cold." Silas sighed, a puff of white breath in the chill air. "Come with me." "Where?" "Just come." He led her not to the house, but to the North Tower, the highest point of the manor, a place she had assumed was used for storage or lookout. They climbed the spiral stairs in silence, the air growing cooler as they ascended. At the top, Silas stopped before a heavy oak door. He fished a key from his pocket, the iron clinking loudly in the quiet stairwell. He unlocked it and pushed the door open. "Go in," he commanded softly. Elora stepped across the threshold and gasped. It was not a storage room. It was a sanctuary. The room was circular, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the crashing sea and the wild moors. The light here was incredible, pure, white, and unforgiving. But it wasn't the view that made her heart stop. In the center of the room stood a brand-new easel, crafted from polished mahogany. Beside it was a table laden with supplies, jars of expensive pigments from France, brushes of sable hair, canvases stretched and ready, and sticks of charcoal of every thickness. Elora spun around, wide-eyed. "Silas?" He was standing in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. He shifted his weight, gripping the cylinder in his hand. "I noticed the charcoal stains on your fingers the day we met," he said, his voice gruff, as if admitting a weakness. "And I saw how you looked at the landscape when we arrived, like you wanted to devour it." "But," Elora stammered, tears pricking her eyes, "my father He said a duchess does not stain her hands. He said it was childish. Silas's face darkened. He stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. Your father is a fool who sold his own flesh and blood for a gambling debt. His opinions hold no weight in my house. In this house, you are not just a duchess, you are Elora. He held out the cylinder. I believe this belongs to you. Elora took it, her hands trembling. She unrolled the paper. It was her sketchbook, the one she had dropped in the library, the one her father had sworn to burn. I retrieved it before we left, Silas admitted, looking away, focusing on the ocean view. I looked through it. The bird in the cage. It was well done. But it was sad. He turned his steel-grey eyes back to her. I do not want to be your jailer, Elora. I know I am older. I know I am not the husband you dreamed of. I cannot change my face, and I cannot change my age. But I can ensure that you do not wither here. Elora looked from the sketchbook to the man standing before her. For weeks, she had seen a monster, a tyrant. But a monster would not have noticed the charcoal on her skin. A tyrant would not have saved her art from the fire. She realized then that the walls he built weren't to keep her out. They were to protect himself. He expected her to hate him. He expected her to be like Rosalind, or like the rumors said of his first wife. He was giving her the means to escape him, even if only in her mind, because he thought that was what she wanted. The tears finally spilled over, hot and fast. You are crying, Silas said, panic entering his voice. He took a step back, looking horrified. I have offended you. I should not have... No. Elora dropped the sketchbook and the charcoal, rushing forward. Before she could think, before fear could stop her, she grabbed his hand, the large, scarred hand that had placed the ring on her finger. She pressed it to her wet cheek. Thank you, she sobbed. Silas, thank you. He froze. His hand was stiff against her face, rough and warm. For a long heartbeat, he didn't move. Then, slowly, hesitantly, his thumb brushed away a tear. I do not want your gratitude, he murmured, his voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated through her. I only want you to stop looking at me as if I am the executioner. I'm not, she whispered, looking up into his eyes. The ice in them was melting, revealing a raw, terrifying intensity beneath. Not anymore. He stared at her for a moment longer, a hunger in his gaze that made her breath hitch. Then, as if remembering himself, he pulled his hand away and stepped back, the mask slamming back into place. Dinner is at 7, he said abruptly. You have the light until then. Use it. He turned and strode out of the room, his boots echoing on the stairs. Elora stood alone in the tower, surrounded by the tools of her soul. She picked up a stick of charcoal, the familiar weight settling into her hand. She looked at the blank canvas. She didn't want to draw a bird in a cage anymore. She began to sketch a face, sharp angles, a scar, and eyes that held a storm. Winter descended upon Blackwood Manor with a vengeance. The cliffs were coated in ice, and the sea below churned a violent, frothy grey. Yet, for the first time in decades, the interior of the manor felt warm. Elora spent her days in the North Tower, the smell of turpentine and oil paint replacing the scent of damp stone. But she was not always alone. More and more frequently, Silas would bring his paperwork to the tower. He would sit in the armchair by the fire, reading reports on tenant farmers and mining yields, while the scratching of Elora's charcoal filled the silence. They didn't speak often, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. One evening, as snow began to fall, Silas looked up from his ledger. The Christmas ball is in 2 weeks. Elora froze, her brush hovering over the canvas. Here? At the manor? "It is a tradition I abandoned 5 years ago," Silas said, his voice tight. "But the local gentry are restless. They want to see the new Duchess. If we do not open our doors, the rumors will only fester." Elora turned to him. "What rumors?" Silas stood, walking to the window to look out at the dark. "That I keep you locked in a dungeon. That I beat you. That you are withering away like—" He stopped, his hand clenching into a fist on the sill. "Like Eleanor?" Elora finished softly. Silas didn't answer, which was answer enough. The night of the ball arrived in a flurry of velvet and anxiety. Elora wore a gown of emerald green silk, commissioned by Silas from a modiste in London. It was cut modestly, but fitted her form perfectly, the colour bringing out the fire in her hair. Around her neck, she wore the blackwood emeralds, heavy, cold stones that felt like a collar. When she descended the grand staircase, the ballroom was already full. The air smelled of beeswax, pine, and expensive perfume. As she appeared, the hum of conversation died instantly. 200 pairs of eyes looked up, hungry for scandal. Silas waited for her at the bottom of the stairs. He wore formal evening dress, his medals from the war pinned to his chest. He looked regal, intimidating, and utterly alone. As Elora reached the final step, he offered his arm. "Ready to face the wolves?" he murmured, his lips barely moving. "As long as you don't feed me to them," she whispered back. For the first time, she saw the corner of his mouth twitch in a near smile. "Never." They moved through the crowd. The greetings were polite, but the eyes were sharp. Elora heard the whispers trailing in their wake like dirty water. "Look how young she is." "He looks like her grandfather. Poor thing, look at her eyes. She's terrified." They were cornered near the punch bowl by Lord Beresford, a man with a red face and a loud, braying laugh. He was one of Silas's few political rivals in the House of Lords. "Blackwood," Beresford boomed, "and this must be the little bride. Charming. I suppose you needed fresh stock, eh?" The old bloodline was getting a bit thin. It was a crude, disgusting remark. Elora felt Silas stiffen beside her, his muscles turning to stone. "Careful, Beresford," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "You are drinking my wine. Do not make me regret pouring it." Beresford sneered, leaning in, reeking of port. "Touchy. I was just admiring the merchandise." "Tell me, my dear." He turned his watery eyes on Elora. "Does he make you wear the lights out? Or does the scar look better in the dark?" The silence in the immediate vicinity was deafening. Silas's hand moved toward his side, as if reaching for a sword that wasn't there. But before the Duke could destroy his reputation by punching a peer of the realm, Elora laughed. It was a light, airy sound that cut through the tension. She stepped forward, placing a possessive hand on Silas's chest, right over his heart. "Lord Beresford," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "I am surprised a man of your age worries so much about the dark. As for my husband's scar—" She looked up at Silas, her eyes soft and adoring, an expression that shocked the crowd into silence. "It is a mark of his courage in defending this country. I find it infinitely more attractive than a face smooth from a life of idleness and cowardice." She turned back to Beresford, her smile razor-sharp. "Now, if you will excuse us, the Duke promised me a waltz." She pulled a stunned Silas onto the dance floor. The orchestra, sensing the cue, began to play. Silas held her stiffly at first, his eyes searching hers. "You made an enemy tonight," he rasped as they spun. "I made a statement," Elora corrected, tightening her grip on his shoulder. "You are my husband, Silas. I will not have them disrespect you." Silas pulled her closer, his hand splaying across the small of her back. The heat between them flared, sudden and consuming. For the rest of the room, the Duke and Duchess were dancing. But for Elora and Silas, the world had narrowed down to the space between their bodies. "You are dangerous, Elora," he whispered against her hair. "Only to those who hurt us," she replied. That night, for the first time, Silas walked her to the door of her bedroom. He stood there, his hand on the frame, conflict warring in his eyes. He wanted to come in. She could see it, and she realized with a start that she wanted him to. But he pulled back. "Sleep well, Elora," he said gruffly, and walked away into the shadows. He was still protecting her, even from himself. Spring brought purple heather to the moors and a tentative happiness to Elora's life. She and Silas had fallen into a rhythm. They rode horses together in the mornings, and in the evenings he would read aloud to her in the library while she sketched. It wasn't a passionate romance of novels, but it was a quiet, sturdy partnership. Elora was beginning to believe that love could grow in rocky soil. Then the letter came. It arrived with the morning post, addressed to Elora Vance, in a handwriting she knew too well. "Elora, I am dying. The consumption has taken hold. I am in the village inn at Blackwood. I beg you, let me see you one last time. I have wronged you, but I am still your father." Elora's hands shook. She knew she should show Silas. She knew he had forbidden contact, but the word dying clawed at her conscience. "Is everything all right?" Silas asked from across the breakfast table, noticing her pale face. "Yes," she lied, sliding the letter into her pocket. "Just a note from the dressmaker." That afternoon, while Silas was at the mines, Elora took a horse and rode to the village. She found her father in a sordid room above the tavern. Reginald Vance looked terrible. Thinner, his skin grey, coughing into a handkerchief. But his eyes were as sharp and calculating as ever. "Elora," he croaked, reaching out a hand. "My beautiful Duchess." "Father." She stood by the door, refusing to come closer. "You said you were dying." I am," he wheezed. "But seeing you, it gives me strength." He sat up, the act of a dying man vanishing a little too quickly. "You look well. Wealth suits you. Does the beast treat you well?" "Do not call him that," Elora snapped. "He is a good man," Reginald sneered. "A good man? A man who bought a wife? Don't be naive, girl. He's just waiting for you to give him an heir so he can lock you away like the last one. That's a lie." "Is it?" Reginald leaned forward. "Did you know he has a safe in his study, behind the portrait of his grandfather? That's where he keeps the medical records of the first wife. Proof that he had her committed to an asylum to get her fortune." "I don't believe you." "Then prove me wrong." Reginald coughed violently. "I need money, Elora. Not for gambling, for doctors, for medicine. If you bring me £500, I will leave. I will disappear. But if you don't, I will go to the press. I will tell them how the Duke of Blackwood bought a teenage bride to cover up his past crimes." "You are blackmailing your own daughter?" Elora felt sick. "I am surviving," Reginald hissed. "Get me the money. Tonight." Elora rode back to the manor in a daze. She didn't believe her father about the asylum, but the threat of the press was real. Silas hated scandal. If the papers found out about the sale, it would destroy the reputation he had worked so hard to rebuild. She had to protect him. She waited until midnight. Silas was asleep in the east wing. Elora crept into the study, a candle in her hand. She didn't want to open the safe to look for medical records. She needed the petty cash box Silas kept in the desk drawer. She would give her father the money, make him leave, and then tell Silas everything later, when the threat was gone. She found the desk unlocked. Her heart hammering, she opened the drawer and found the cash box. She counted out the notes. I thought we had moved past the need for secrets. The voice came from the shadows, deep and freezing cold. Elora gasped, dropping the notes. They fluttered to the floor like dead leaves. Silas stepped into the candlelight. He was wearing his dressing gown, his face a mask of absolute fury. But beneath the anger, Elora saw something worse. Betrayal. "Silas," she stammered, "it's not what it looks like." "It looks like my wife is stealing from me," he said, walking closer. He looked at the money on the floor. £500, a substantial sum. Is it for him? For Vance? Elora froze. "How did you know?" "I am the Duke of Blackwood," he said bitterly. "I know when a rat enters my village. I was told your father arrived today. I was told you visited him." "He is sick," Elora pleaded. "He threatened to go to the press, to ruin you. I just wanted to pay him to leave." "So you stole from me?" Silas roared, the sound shaking the room. "You didn't come to me? You didn't trust me to handle him?" "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That I would hurt him." Silas laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Or were you afraid I would find out that you were planning to leave with him?" "No, I would never leave you." "Lies." Silas slammed his hand on the desk. "I gave you everything, Elora. My home, my name, my trust. And the moment your father snaps his fingers, you turn back into his little accomplice." "That isn't fair," Elora cried, tears streaming down her face. "I was trying to protect you." "I do not need protection from a child," Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I should have known. You are a Vance. Deceit runs in your blood." He turned away from her, unable to look at her. "Get out," he said. "Silas, get out," he yelled. "Go back to your room. Do not leave it. Tomorrow I will decide what to do with you. Perhaps I will send you back to him. You deserve each other." Elora fled the room, her heart shattering in her chest. She ran to the West Wing, threw herself on the bed, and cried until her throat burned. She had tried to save him, and in doing so, she had proven his worst fear true, that everyone he let in would eventually betray him. Downstairs, Silas poured himself a drink, his hand trembling. He looked at the money on the floor. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to cast her out. But as he stared at the scattered notes, he saw something else on the floor. Elora had dropped a piece of paper in her panic. It wasn't a banknote, it was a sketch. He picked it up. It was a drawing of him. Not the Duke, not the monster, but Silas. He was sleeping in the armchair in the tower, a look of peace on his face that he hadn't worn in years. At the bottom, in her elegant script, she had written, "The man who gave me my wings." Silas stared at the drawing, the whiskey glass forgotten in his hand. The anger began to drain away, replaced by a cold dread. "What have I done?" he thought. She wasn't stealing, she was panicked. But before he could go to her, a loud crash echoed from the front gates, shouting, the barking of dogs, and the smell of smoke. The smell of smoke was acrid and unmistakable. It wasn't the cozy scent of a hearth. It was the choking, chemical stench of burning varnish and old wood. Silas sprinted from the study, the sketch of himself still crushed in his hand, shouting for the servants. "Fire! The West Wing! Get the buckets!" Panic surged through him. The West Wing. That was where Elora was. He reached the main hall to find chaos. The front doors had been smashed open. Standing in the foyer, illuminated by the flickering orange glow coming from the adjacent drawing room, was Reginald Vance. He was drunk, swaying dangerously, a torch in one hand and a sack of silverware in the other. "I told her!" Reginald screamed, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "I told her I needed the money. If the Duke wouldn't give it, the house would pay." "You madman!" Silas roared, lunging forward. Reginald swung the torch wildly. "Stay back, or I'll burn it all. The tapestries, the paintings. The girl. Where is she?" Silas's voice was a terrifying growl. "Upstairs," Reginald sneered, gesturing with the torch towards the grand staircase, which was already licking with flames near the banister. "Crying in her room, like a good little victim." Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't waste time subduing the old man. He charged past him, leaping up the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the heat that singed his eyebrows and the smoke filling his lungs. "Elora!" he screamed. He reached the landing of the west wing. The corridor was filled with thick, black smoke. The fire, started in the drawing room directly below, had travelled up the curtains and into the walls. The floorboards were hot beneath his boots. He kicked open the door to the master suite. "Elora!" The room was empty. The window was open, the curtains fluttering in the draught, feeding the fire. Terror, cold and absolute, gripped his heart. Had she jumped? Had she run? "Silas!" The voice came from the hallway behind him. He spun around. Elora was emerging from the shadows of the servants' staircase, her face streaked with soot, clutching a wet cloth over her mouth. She hadn't stayed in her room. She had gone to warn the maids on the upper floor. "Get out!" Silas yelled, rushing to her and grabbing her arm. "The stairs are burning!" "My father!" She coughed, her eyes wide with horror. "He's downstairs! He did this! Forget him! We have to go!" Silas pulled her toward the east wing, intending to use the servants' exit there. But as they crossed the landing, a massive beam from the ceiling above the main staircase groaned and gave way. It crashed down with a thunderous boom, blocking the path and sending a shower of sparks and debris everywhere. They were trapped. The fire was behind them in the west wing, and the debris blocked the east. "The tower!" Elora gasped, pointing upward. "The north tower! It's stone! The fire can't reach the top." "Go!" Silas commanded. They scrambled up the spiral stone stairs of the tower, the heat rising with them. They burst into the studio, Elora's sanctuary. Silas slammed the heavy iron-reinforced door and locked it. The roar of the fire was muffled, replaced by the howling of the wind outside the glass windows. They were safe from the flames, but they were trapped hundreds of feet above the cliffs. Silas collapsed against the door, sliding down to the floor, coughing. Elora dropped to her knees beside him. "You came for me," she whispered, touching his face. "You thought I was a thief, and you still came for me." Silas looked at her, his steel eyes swimming with emotion. He uncrumpled the paper he had been holding this entire time, the sketch she had drawn of him. "I found this," he rasped, holding it up. "I saw what you wrote. The man who gave me my wings." Elora sobbed, burying her face in his chest. "I wasn't stealing for him, Silas. I was stealing to make him go away, to protect you. He wanted to ruin your name." "I know," Silas said, wrapping his arms around her, holding her so tight it hurt. "I was a fool, a jealous, blind old fool. I thought you couldn't possibly love a man like me. I thought you were just waiting for a way out." "I don't want a way out," Elora cried fiercely, pulling back to look at him. "I want you. I want this house. Even if it burns to the ground, as long as you are standing, I am home." Silas stared at her, the last of his defenses crumbling into dust. In the light of the fire raging below them, reflecting off the glass, he finally let himself believe her. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't the polite peck of a wedding ceremony. It was a kiss of desperation, of passion, of a man claiming his soulmate. Outside, the storm broke. Rain, heavy and torrential, began to pound against the tower windows, a deluge sent by the heavens. Below them, in the burning foyer, Reginald Vance was trying to drag the sack of silver out the front door. The heat was unbearable. He coughed, his lungs failing him, but his greed was stronger. He saw a gap in the flames and lunged for the exit. He didn't see the heavy crystal chandelier above him, its chain melted by the intensity of the heat. With a sickening crash, the chandelier fell. Reginald screamed once before he was pinned beneath the twisted metal and crystal. The silver coin spilled out of the sack, rolling across the floor, useless and mocking as the smoke consumed him. It was the hardest karma of all, crushed by the weight of the luxury he had sold his daughter to obtain. The rain saved Blackwood Manor. It doused the flames before they could consume the stone structure, though the west wing was gutted and the grand staircase destroyed. Fire brigades from the village arrived an hour later, finding the Duke and Duchess huddled together in the North Tower, safe and unharmed. The funeral for Reginald Vance was a quiet affair. Elora stood by the grave, her hand firmly in Silas's. She did not cry. She had mourned her father long ago, the day he sold her. The man buried today was a stranger who had let his demons win. The recovery was slow. The manor smelled of smoke for months. But amidst the reconstruction, something beautiful began to bloom. Silas was no longer the recluse of the cliffs. The near-death experience had shaken him awake. He hired architects to rebuild the West Wing, not as dark sleeping quarters, but as a bright, airy gallery for Elora's work. He dismissed the rumors and the gossip. When they went into town, he walked with his head high, his arm around his wife's waist. And the villagers, seeing the way the ogre looked at his young bride, with reverence and open adoration, stopped whispering. 1 year later, the Blackwood Gallery opened its doors. Critics came from London, lured by the scandal, but staying for the talent. Elora's paintings were raw, emotional, and breathtaking. But the centerpiece of the exhibition, hung in the place of honor, was not a landscape or a bird. It was a large oil painting titled The Guardian. It depicted a man standing in the shadows, half his face scarred and severe, the other half illuminated by a warm, golden light. In his hands, he held a small, injured bird, protecting it from a storm. The man's eyes were steel, but they were filled with a tenderness that made the viewers weep. It was Silas. On the opening night, Silas stood before the painting, mesmerized. He felt a small hand slip into his. "Do you like it?" Elora asked, her other hand resting on the small swell of her stomach, where the future heir, or heiress, of Blackwood was growing. Silas turned to her. He kissed her forehead, then her lips, ignoring the crowd of aristocrats watching them. "I love it," he whispered, "but not as much as I love the artist." Elora smiled, radiant and free. "Imagine that," she teased gently. "The beast loves the beauty." "No," Silas corrected, pulling her close. "The man loves his wife." And in the end, that was the only title that mattered. What a journey. Elora and Silas proved that love isn't about age, wealth, or contracts. It's about seeing the true soul of another person. Silas thought he was a monster, unworthy of love, and Elora thought she was a victim with no future. But through art, patience, and a terrifying trial by fire, they destroyed their old lives to build a new one together. And let's not forget the hard karma that finally caught up with Reginald, a powerful reminder that greed can be a heavy burden, literally. If this story touched your heart, or if you cheered when Silas finally realized the truth, please give this video a big like. It helps us create more dramatic stories for you. Don't forget to share this with a friend who loves a good romance with a twist, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next emotional roller coaster. What did you think of the ending? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.